Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We are continuing to learn halachos sukkah. We'll be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Pei Ches Amud Aleph. We pick up today on the bottom line of Pei Zayin Amud Beis, Siman Taf Reish Chaf Ches, in the midst of Sif Aleph. So here in Siman Taf Reish Chaf Ches, we have been discussing the halacha of a sukkah tachas sukkah, a sukkah that is built beneath another sukkah. The easy way to imagine that is a two-story sukkah. So you have two flights. You have one sukkah upstairs, one sukkah downstairs. Now the Mechaber here in the beginning of Sif Aleph told us that whether or not these sukkahs are going to be kosher, whether the upstairs one is going to be kosher, the downstairs one to be kosher, it's going to depend on the condition of the sukkahs. So the Mechaber told us that if the upstairs sukkah is a viable sukkah, if the upstairs sukkah is a viable kosher sukkah, so that means that it has enough schach, it's tzilasa miruba mechamasa, and the floor of the upstairs sukkah, which is essentially the schach of the downstairs sukkah, is stable enough so that it could support the weight of living in the upstairs sukkah, and the upstairs sukkah also has sufficient height, it has the minimum height of 10 tfachim, then the upstairs sukkah is a viable sukkah. But then the downstairs sukkah is going to be puzzle, because the downstairs sukkah is going to be a sukkah tachas sukkah. And we learn out from a pasuk that that a sukkah, when you sit in a sukkah, you have to be sitting in one sukkah. You cannot be sitting beneath two sukkahs. So, again, if the upstairs sukkah is a viable sukkah, so that means it has the minimum height requirement of 10 tfachim, it has sufficient schach, and you could live in it because the floor is strong enough to support your weight and the weight of all the things you need to live in the sukkah, then the upstairs sukkah could be kosher, but the downstairs sukkah will be puzzle because it's a sukkah tachas sukkah. However, the Mechaber said, if that's not the case, if the upstairs sukkah is not a viable kosher sukkah, let's say it doesn't have the minimum interior height of 10 tvachim, or let's say its floor is not strong enough and it can't support the weight of living in it, so then the upstairs sukkah is not a viable sukkah, and then the downstairs sukkah is kosher, assuming it has enough schach, because the downstairs sukkah is a kosher sukkah, and it's not a sukkah tachas sukkah. Hope that came out clear enough. Okay. Now, again, in order for the downstairs sukkah to be kosher, it has to have enough schach. So if you want the downstairs sukkah to be kosher, it has to have sufficient schach, and it cannot be a sukkah tachas sukkah. So the upstairs sukkah cannot be a viable kosher sukkah. Now let's go to the bottom line here on Pei Zayin Amud Beis, when the Mechaber says, V'im eina mesucheches kihilchasa. Let's say the downstairs sukkah does not have sufficient schach. Now, the simple way of reading the Mechaber here is, the Mechaber is continuing off where we left off in the previous year. So that means the upstairs sukkah is not a viable kosher sukkah. Let's say the upstairs sukkah doesn't have a minimum interior height of 10 tvachim. So the upstairs sukkah is not a kosher sukkah, and therefore you don't have a problem of sukkah tachas sukkah. Now, but still in all, for the downstairs sukkah to be kosher, it has to have sufficient schach. Therefore, says the Mechaber here, Ve'im eina mesucheches kihilchasa. Let's say the downstairs sukkah does not have proper schach. What does that mean? The downstairs sukkah is chamasa miruba mitzilasa. There's more sunlight coming into the downstairs sukkah than there is shade. So it's very nice that you don't have a problem of sukkah tachas sukkah, because the upstairs sukkah is not a sukkah, but you still don't have a kosher sukkah downstairs because you don't have tzilasa miruba mechamasa. So v'im eina mesucheches kihilchasa, then right away you would have a problem. But, says the Mechaber, how about umiskasheres al yedei schach elyoina? Here's an interesting case. What if the downstairs sukkah is tzilasa meruba mechamasa? It has more shade than sunlight. You know why? Because when you take the shade that's being given from the upstairs schach together with the shade that's being given by the downstairs schach, right? You have two layers of schach here. By blending the two schachos together, now in the downstairs sukkah, you have tzilasa meruba mechamasa. So again, what do we have in this case? we don't have a problem of sukkah tachas sukkah, because the upstairs sukkah doesn't have an interior height of 10 tvachim. Or maybe we don't have a problem of sukkah tachas sukkah because the schach of the downstairs sukkah is not strong enough to support the weight of people living in a sukkah upstairs. So we don't have a problem of sukkah tachas sukkah. That's not a problem. But now we want to know, could the downstairs sukkah be a kosher sukkah? Does it have sufficient schach? So if it has sufficient schach on its own, we have no problem at all. It has sufficient schach, it's a kosher sukkah. We don't care at all about the upstairs schach. And like the Mechaber said in the previous year, even if the schach of the upstairs sukkah is 30 amas up in the sky, it doesn't passel the downstairs schach. Who cares? The downstairs sukkah is a perfectly kosher sukkah on its own. But in this case of the Mechaber is talking about a different case. Now, we don't have a problem of sukkah tachas sukkah, but the downstairs sukkah on its own doesn't have a sufficient amount of schach. If you would use only the schach of the downstairs sukkah, the downstairs sukkah would be chamasa meruba mitzilasa. Happens to be that if you go into the downstairs sukkah, it's tzilasa meruba mechamasa. Why? Because when you add in the upstairs schach, between the upstairs schach and the downstairs schach, now the downstairs sukkah is tzilasa meruba mechamasa. In that case, says the Mechaber, that sukkah could be kosher, but tzarich shalayiyas chacha el yaina gavoya min haaretz lamayla me'esrim ama. In this latter case of the Mechaber, you're using both layers of schach. You want to use the upstairs schach and the downstairs schach. In that case, the upstairs schach has to be fully kosher schach. In order for it to be fully kosher schach, it has to be less than 20 amas up. If it's over 20 amas, sukkah shi gavay l'bala mesr amma psula. In the case that we had in the previous year, we were talking about where the downstairs sukkah had enough schach in its own right. And therefore, even if the upstairs schach was located above 20 amas, we didn't care because we don't need it. And we're not worried that the upstairs schach is going to invalidate the downstairs schach, because the upstairs schach is not inherently posel schach. It's kosher schach that's just located in the wrong place. It's kosher schach that's located above 20 amas. But that doesn't invalidate the downstairs schach. Now, in this case of the Mechaber, here we want to use the upstairs schach, because in this case, we don't have enough schach on the downstairs sukkah. So we want to blend the downstairs schach together with the upstairs schach. In that case, the upstairs schach, you want to use it, it has to be located under 20 amas. Okay, now let's go to the Mishnah Berurah on the bottom line of Pei Zayin and Beis. Mishnah Berurah is cut and test. Umiskasheres al yedei schacha el yoina. In the case where you don't have a problem of sukkah tachas sukkah, because the upstairs sukkah is not a viable sukkah, either it doesn't have the minimal interior height, or it's not strong enough to support people in the upstairs, so you don't have a problem of sukkah tachas sukkah, but you want to make the bottom sukkah a kosher sukkah, but it doesn't have enough schach, and you want to make it kosher by using the upstairs schach. Umiskasheres al yedei schach el yoina. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Tahainu, what is this case? Shal yedei shneihem, between the two layers of schach, between the upstairs schach and the downstairs schach, haisa tzilasa meruba mechamasa, now the downstairs sukkah becomes tzilasa meruba mechamasa, ukeshera hatachtoina, now the downstairs sukkah is going to be kosher. Now the downstairs sukkah is fine. Why is the downstairs sukkah fine? Because it has enough schach. Between the two layers of schach, it has a sufficient amount of schach, and there's no problem of sukkah tachas sukkah, because the upstairs sukkah is not a viable sukkah. Now, here's the interesting thing. In this case that the Chavetz Chaim gave me, the way he lays out the case, neither layer of schach on its own would be tzilasa meruba mechamasa. In order to have tzilasa meruba mechamasa, we must blend together both layers of schach. In that case, the Sharetzion points out here in Ois Cut and Test, it doesn't matter, even if the upstairs sukkah, let's say, does have an interior height of 10 tvachim, and let's say the upstairs sukkah is strong enough to support people living in it. Still, the downstairs sukkah is going to be kosher, and the upstairs sukkah is going to be puzzle. Why? Very simple. The upstairs sukkah is possible because it doesn't have enough schach. The upstairs layer of schach is chamasa meruba mitzilasa. So it's very nice that it has an interior height of 10 tfachim, and it's very nice that it's strong enough that you could live in it, but it doesn't have enough schach. So the upstairs sukkah is puzzle. Since the upstairs sukkah is puzzle, there's no problem of sukkah tachas sukkah on the downstairs sukkah. Now, even though the downstairs sukkah doesn't have enough schach on its own, by blending the downstairs schach together with the upstairs schach, the downstairs sukkah does have enough schach. Now, the downstairs sukkah is fully kosher. Now the Chavetz Chaim gives me another case here. Let's say the upstairs sukkah has a very, very nice thick layer of schach. So the schach on the upstairs sukkah is enough to make tzilasa meruba mechamasa. But the downstairs sukkah doesn't have enough schach. The downstairs sukkah on its own would be chamasa meruba mitzilasa. But it doesn't matter because the upstairs sukkah is tzilasa meruba mechamasa, so the schach of the upstairs sukkah is giving enough shade to the downstairs sukkah. So the downstairs sukkah has enough schach, but not from its own schach. It only has enough schach from the upstairs schach. In that case, says the Mishnah Berurah, af ha'elyoina kshera. In this case, really, the upstairs sukkah is kosher too. What does that mean? You see, in this case, it's not a sukkah tachas sukkah. You're not going to call the downstairs sukkah a sukkah tachas sukkah, because in this case, the downstairs sukkah is not its own sukkah. The downstairs sukkah, its schach is chamasa meruba mitzilasa. So the downstairs sukkah on its own would not be a viable sukkah. So in reality, in this case, there's only one sukkah. It's one sukkah that has two levels. It's not a sukkah with schach and then on top of it another sukkah with schach. It's a downstairs sukkah that has an insufficient amount of schach. So the downstairs sukkah can't be called a sukkah. It's only called a sukkah because it's in the tail of the upstairs sukkah. So in that case, really, both floors could be kosher sukkahs. What's the case where they could both be kosher? If the upstairs sukkah has an interior height of 10 tvachim, and the floor of the upstairs sukkah is strong enough that it could support living in the upstairs sukkah, but, and I don't know exactly what the mitzias of this case would be, even though the floor of the upstairs sukkah is strong enough to support the weight of people living upstairs, it's still chamasa miruba mitzilasa for the downstairs. So it's not good schach. So there's only one layer of good schach here, only the upstairs. Only the roof of this two-story structure is tzilasa meruba mechamasa. So both floors are one sukkah. It's not a sukkah tachas sukkah. Both floors are one sukkah. So this is the case of the Gemara. Those of you who are learning Daf Yomi, this is the case in the Mishnah on Daf Tes Amud Beis in Sukkah, where the Gemara says that there are some times that both floors could be kosher. In this case, both floors are kosher because it's only a sukkah based on the top schach. So it's not a sukkah tachas sukkah. And even the top floor has all the requirements of a kosher sukkah. So here you can have where both floors are kosher. Okay. Now we move along to Sif Beis. If somebody makes a sukkah on top of a wagon, or all the way at the top of a ship, says the Mechaber, if these structures are so flimsy that they would not be able to stand up to a ruach mitzuya, to a common wind on land, then psula, then these sukkahs are possible because they're not even a diras aroi. In order for a sukkah to be considered a diras aroi, a temporary dira, it has to be at least strong enough to be able to stand up to a regular ruach mitzuya. So the Mechaber tells me, you made a sukkah on top of a wagon, you made a sukkah on top of a ship. It depends. How strong is it? If it can't stand up to even a ruach mitzuya of land, then it's not even a diras aroi, and then it's puzzle. And now here comes the big chiddush of the Mechaber. But if this sukkah is strong enough that it would be able to stand up to the common wind, to a ruach mitzuya of land, a ruach mitzuya that you would have on land, then afilu im einu yechola lamed beruach mitzuya diyam You went ahead and you made a sukkah on top of a ship. And the Mishnah Berurah is going to say that when the Mechaber says that you did it beroish hasvina, he means all the way on top of the ship where the wind is very, very strong. Now we know that, forget about going out on a ship, even when you go down to the beach, the winds are much more powerful. When the winds coming off the ocean are much more powerful than the winds that you have inland. Now imagine up on a ship. You're out in the middle of the sea, up on top of a ship, the wind is very powerful. The Mechaber says, you built this sukkah, and the sukkah cannot stand up to a ruach metzuya diyam. It's not strong enough to withstand a common wind that you get out on the sea. But it is strong enough to stand up to a common wind that you would get on land. Ksher. That sukkah is kosher. Even though you're building it out by sea, you're building it up on a ship out by sea, so you would think it has to stand up to a ruach metzuya diyam. No, it doesn't. It has to stand up to a ruach metzuya diabosha, not to a ruach metzuya diyam. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Yud, Beroish ha'agola. Let's say you built a sukkah on top of a wagon. The chiddush over here, says the Chavetz Chaim, is after betalta lo v'loi kaviyah. Even though this sukkah, wherever you move the wagon, you hitch up the wagon to a team of oxen and you start pulling the wagon along, it's a moving sukkah. Says the Chavetz Chaim, after betaltala, even though this is a moving sukkah, v'loi kaviyah, and it's not fixed in place, it's still a kosher sukkah. Valkain, based on this, says the Chavetz Chaim, hasoicharim, peddlers, yechaylim lasoi sukkah, they can make a sukkah ba'agoloi shalahem, on their wagons, shekairin beidel. These are called beidel wagons. They could make a sukkah on these beidel wagons. Ubelvad sheyeh b'soicha gavaya asar tvachim. Certainly, you have to have the minimum interior measurement of a height of 10 tvachim. V'roichav shiva tvachim, and you have to have a width. You have to have 7 tvachim by 7 tvachim of space inside the sukkah. B'loi hagalgalim, and this measurement has to be the interior of the sukkah. So you cannot go out to the outside of the wagon. You can't go out to the outside of the wagon and measure the exterior from the outside of one wheel to the outside of one wheel. The measurement, in order for the sukkah to be kosher, has to be an interior measurement inside the sukkah. Achein, however, says the Chavetz Chaim, tzarich sheyiksherena sham b'chayzik, you have to tie this sukkah structure to the top of the wagon well. Sheti yechayla lamed beruach hametzuya ba'aretz. It has to be strong enough so that it would be able to stand up to a common wind if it was sitting on the ground. Now, there's an interesting Sharet Zion over here, Sharet Zion Ois Katan Yud Aleph. He says over here, V'hinei Prima Gadim Yatsa Lidain B'davar HaChadash. He brings down here from the Prima Gadim, says the Prima Gadim wants to discuss an interesting chiddush. He wants to say that Dafka B'shasha Imedes V'loi B'shasha Heleches Im Hasusim. He wants to suggest that you could make a sukkah on top of a wagon, and the sukkah is kosher even though it's moving, that's only when the wagon is parked. If you park the wagon and the wagon is a sukkah on top, you could go into the sukkah and that's a kosher sukkah. But if the wagon is hooked up to a team of oxen and you want to eat in the sukkah while you're traveling on top of the wagon, that the Pri Megadim says you can't do. And he draws a distinction between the case of a wagon and the case of a ship. The ship is out at sea. Certainly, when the Mechaber says that you could make a sukkah b'roish hasfina, he's talking about when the ship is out at sea and the ship is moving. So how come by the sfina you could use the sukkah even when it's moving and by the wagon you cannot? So he says over here, V'shani sfina de'urcha b'kach. The Pri Megadim wants to suggest that when it comes to a ship, that's normal. The ship is always moving. A wagon is made to start and stop. Therefore, you want to use it as a sukkah, you have to stop it. A sfina, you don't stop it. Aval Bikuri Yaakov Hisagalav Ayin Sham Udvarv Nechainim. The Bikuri Yaakov doesn't recognize any such distinction over here, and he says that the sukkah made on the top of the wagon would be kosher even when the wagon was moving. Ois Katan Yud Aleph in the Mishnah Berurah, Oy B'roish hasfina, or you made a sukkah on top of a ship. Says the Chavetz Chaim, what does it mean b'roish hasfina, on the top of the ship? Hu makom gavoi shel sfina. He means all the way up on the upper deck. You made a sukkah. V'hu gavoi ha'ma'od. And let's remember that the upper deck of a ship is usually quite high off of the sea level. V'haruach shoylet sham, and it's certainly very windy over there. V'yikrasa, and it could uproot the sukkah. If this sukkah cannot stand up to a ruach mitzuya di'abasha, if it can't stand up to a common wind that you would have inland, what the Mechaber wants to say is, if you didn't tie down this sukkah at all, so you really didn't build a sukkah in a strong way. This is really a very weak sukkah, and even if you would have built this sukkah inland, with as soon as a breeze would come, it would blow over. So in that case, it's certainly not a kosher sukkah. She'ez a ruach sheyava ya'akrena, if it's a sukkah that if any breeze comes, it's going to blow it over, psula, that sukkah is puzzle. And over here, the Chavetz Chaim takes the word straight out of Rashi and Daf Chav Gimel in sukkah, ta'afilu duras harai loy havya. A sukkah that can't stand up even to a ruach mitzuya di'abasha, you cannot call that even a diras harai, and therefore that's a puzzle of sukkah. Ais katan yud gimel. However, here was the chiddush that the Mechaber told me, and it could stand up to a ruach mitzuya di'abasha. It could stand up to a common wind of land, but it cannot stand up to a ruach mitzuya diyam. Then the Mechaber said, that's okay. I see my stream dropped out over there for a second, but now it seems to be back up. Okay. The ruach mitzuya diyam hu keruach she'ena mitzuya di'abasha. The Chavetz Chaim is pointing out there's a very big difference between a ruach mitzuya diyam and a ruach mitzuya di'abasha. He says a ruach mitzuya diyam is much more powerful. My stream. Okay, it looks like we're back up here. I saw that the stream dropped out for a moment, but now it looks like we're working again. Okay, so I paused while the stream was out. We were discussing over here Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yud Gimel, right? So the Mechaber is talking about where you built a sukkah on top of a ship, and the sukkah is strong enough that it can stand up to a ruach mitzuya di'abasha. It could stand up to a common wind that you would have on land, but it cannot stand up to a ruach mitzuya diyam. It can't stand up to the common type of wind that you would have out at sea. And the Chavetz Chaim explained, the ruach mitzuya diyam, the common types of wind that you will have out at sea, hu keruach she'ena mitzuya di'abasha, is as strong as a ruach she'ena mitzuya based on land. Right? The wind that you have at sea is much more powerful than the wind that you have inland. Still, it's cutting your dalit. Still, in all, the Mechaber said kshera, this sukkah would be kosher. Why is this sukkah kosher? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, Ta'al kol panim mechlal diras aroi loy nafka. Because, says the Chavetz Chaim, as long as this sukkah is a sukkah that could stand up to a ruach mitzuya di'abasha, as long as it could stand up to a land-based ruach mitzuya, you cannot say that it's not a diras aroi. Even though it can't stand up to the ruach mitzuya where you are, you're out at sea, and it can't stand up to the ruach mitzuya out here at sea. Doesn't matter. A structure that can stand up to a ruach mitzuya di'abasha is considered at least a diras aroi. Now, it's very puzzling why this would be. Let's finish off the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says, "Va'afilu b'shasha hileches alayam." This is true even when the ship is traveling out at sea. So it is going to be exposed to a ruach mitzuya diyam. Still in all, even though it cannot stand up to that ruach mitzuya shel yam, it's still considered enough of a diras harai, and it's still a kosher sukkah. So you take a look in the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan, I guess he was struggling with this issue, and he writes a lashon. He says, "The lav b'chol eis have a ruach mitzuya diyam." He says that while it's true that out at sea there's a ruach mitzuya that's much more powerful than the ruach mitzuya diyam, it's not constant. The ruach, this that we call the ruach mitzuya diyam, that's more powerful than the ruach mitzuya diyabasha, it's not constant. And since it's not constant, we could at least call this structure a diras harai, and it makes a kosher sukkah. Okay, now we go to Sif Gimel. Says the Mechaber, Asa beroish hagamol. Let's say you erected a sukkah on top of a camel. What does it mean to erect a sukkah on top of a camel? Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Tezvav, beroish hagamol, hainu she'asa sham hadafanois bein chatoitroi seha. You made the walls of the sukkah between the humps. So it's actually the humps of the sukkah. The humps of the camel are two of the walls of the sukkah. And I guess you put up another two walls, or another one wall even, on one side of the humps, and then you put schach on top of the humps and these walls. The sichech al-gaban, you put up schach on top. So, says the Mechaber, Asa b'roish hagamol, you made a sukkah on top of a camel in this fashion. Oy b'roish ha'ilan, or if you made a treehouse sukkah, you made a nice little treehouse up in a tree, and you put schach over it. And the treehouse is built in such a way that the branches of the tree are not covering over the sukkah, so you don't have a problem of schach posel going over the sukkah. In both of these cases, says the Mechaber, kshera, the sukkah is kosher, but you have a problem. Ve'ein oilen la b'yomtiv, but on yomtiv itself, not al chalamayid you won't have a problem, but on yomtiv itself, you're not going to be allowed to go into this sukkah. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is cut in Tezvav. Well, we did Tezvav. Tezayin. Beroisha Ilan. You made a treehouse sukkah. Tikain Moishavai Beroishai. You set up a platform. You made a nice little treehouse, a place to live, up in the top of the tree. Va'asa sham bechitzais uschach. So you built a treehouse at the top of the tree, where the branches of the tree are not going to go over the sukkah. You went up to the top of the tree and you built a treehouse and you put schach on top of it. So the sukkah is kosher. There's nothing here that the sukkah shouldn't be kosher. You have kosher walls, you have kosher schach. But Ois Cotton Yudzayin ve'ein oilun la. However, you're not allowed to go into this sukkah on Yom Tov. Why? Says the Chavetz Chaim. Mipnei she'asar lehishtamesh b'Yom Tov b'Balei Chaim u'v'mechuber. Because here we have a different problem. Kamosha Kasav Reish Siman Shin Lamed Vav. You're not allowed to use a tree, and you're not allowed to use an animal, a Baal Chai, on Shabbos. We know that on Shabbos you're not allowed to even go outside and lean on a tree. You're not allowed to hang your hat on a tree. You're not allowed to take a ball off of a tree on Shabbos or on Yom Tov. Why not? The Chachamim made a gzera where they were afraid that if you're going to use a tree in any way, you might come to break off a branch. So we don't want you using a tree. You're certainly not allowed to climb a tree, but you're not allowed to use a tree at all. So if your sukkah is in the tree, if you climb up, even if you had a ladder that was going straight to your treehouse, so that you're not climbing on the tree itself, but when you go into the treehouse, you're making use of the tree. You're supported by the tree. So you're not allowed to use a tree. You can't go into this treehouse on sukkah on sukkahs, on Yom Tov. Al Chalamayid you'd be allowed to, but not on Yom Tov proper. Same problem you have with the Baal Chai. You're not allowed to ride on an animal on Yom Tov. That's also a takanas Chazal. Chazal were afraid that if you would be allowed to ride an animal on Yom Tov, you might go over to a tree, break off a branch, to use it as a switch to drive the animal. So you're not allowed to climb up on an animal. You have a sukkah on top of a camel. It's very nice that the sukkah is a kosher sukkah, but you can't use that sukkah because you can't go on the animal. Continues the Chavetz Chaim here. Even if you build a sukkah on the ground, let's say you build a sukkah and you essentially make a 3-wall sukkah, and you take your bamboo poles and you support one end of the bamboo poles, let's say on one wall of the sukkah, and the other side of the bamboo poles you support on the tree. That's also a problem. Asur lalo isla b'Shabbos v'Yom Tov. You would not be allowed to go into this sukkah on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Why not? Gzeira shema yishtamesh b'haschach. We're afraid that you might make use of the schach. What does that mean? She'aniach sham chafatzav. You might put something down. Maybe you need a place to put your hat. You'll put your hat on top of the schach. A yisla by shum davar. Or maybe you'll hang a basket of bread from the schach. V'nimtza mishtamesh al yedei ha'ilon. And again, you're using the tree. Now over here, you're not using the tree directly. It's not over here, you're not putting your hat on the tree. What you're doing is you're hanging a basket of bread on a pole that's being supported by the tree. So it's one step removed from the tree. In the first case, you put your hat on the tree itself. In this case, you're putting a basket on a pole that is supported by the tree. But that's also asur on Shabbos and Yom Tov. You're only allowed to use a tree on Shabbos or Yom Tov if you're 2 steps removed from the tree. 1 step removed from the tree is not enough. However, says the Chavetz Chaim, ve'efshar, it's possible to say, Tedafka b'yamim arishonim, it was only in earlier days, in the times of the Mishnah, shahayu regilin lehishtamesh b'schach, when for some reason it was common in those days to actually use the schach, lahaniach, to place things on it, v'lisleis sham chefzeim, or to hang things from the schach. That's when the Chazal made this gzera, and they said you can't sit in a sukkah where the schach is being supported by the tree, lest you come to use the tree through the schach. Aval, however, akshav, nowadays, she'ein regilin b'kach, where people don't do this, ein chayshishin l'kach, we wouldn't be concerned. And therefore you would be allowed to go into this sukkah, the sukkah where the schach is being supported by the tree, but the sukkah is not. You would be allowed to go into it on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Nevertheless, says the Chavetz Chaim, lechatchila ein lismeiches haschach ala ilon. Lechatchila, you're not allowed to support your schach by a tree anyway. Why not? She'ein ma'amidin es haschach lechatchila ela bedavar haroi l'sichuch. Because lechatchila, you're not allowed to support your schach with something that's not itself kosher to be schach. Now, is a tree kosher to be schach? No, a tree is mechubar l'karka, and therefore the tree is not kosher as schach. Therefore, you can't use the tree as a limud. You can't use the tree to support your schach lichatchila. K'may shekasa b'siman tafresh chavtes ayin sham hatam. However, says the Chavetz Chaim, v'em not kundasin be'ilan. Let's say you took a 2x4 and you screwed a 2x4 to the tree. So the tree goes up vertically, and you took a 2x4 and you nailed a 2x4 horizontally to the tree. And now you want to take your bamboo poles and you want to rest them on the 2x4 that you nailed to the tree. That's the case that the Chavetz Chaim is describing over here. V'em not kundasin be'ilan. If you nailed a pole to the tree, v'samach haschach aleihen, and now you want to support the schach on that pole, shari af lechatchila. That would be mutter to do even lechatchila. Why? Because that's not a limud. That's a limud dim limud. The problem of a limud, the problem of using a support for your schach, when that support is not kosher to be schach, is only when the thing that's not kosher as schach is the limud. It's the thing that's actually supporting the schach. That you cannot do, lechatchila. So to take the bamboo poles and rest them on the tree is the limud, and the tree is pasal as schach. Lechatchila, that's a problem. But in our second case, you have a 2x4 that's nailed to the tree. The 2x4 itself is not pasal as schach. Now you take the bamboo poles and you rest them on the 2x4. The 2x4 is the limud. The tree is a limud de limud. The tree is what's supporting the 2x4. A limud de limud could be something that is pasal schach. The Chazon Ish, very famous Chazon Ish, the Chazon Ish disagrees with this. The Chazon Ish holds that schach, something that's pasal to be schach, shouldn't even be used as a limud de limud. Ois cotton yud ches. The Mechaber said that if you make this sukkah on top of a tree or on top of an animal, ein oidel la b'yom tov. Says the Mishnah, let's say you did make a treehouse sukkah, and you transgressed the halacha, and you went and climbed up the tree, and you went into your treehouse sukkah on Yom Tov, yotza yidei chayvasai, b'di'eved you're yotza, and you don't have a problem of mitzvah haba ba'avera. He brings this down from Rashi and several other Rishonim as well. V'ayin b'pri megadim shemisupik. He points you to the pri megadim who is misupik. He questions, Im ein loy b'yom tov rak sukkah al gabe behema oy ilon. Let's say this is the only sukkah that you have available to you on Yom Tov. All you have is this treehouse sukkah, or this sukkah that's on top of a balchai. You don't have any other sukkah. So if you don't go into the sukkah, you're not going to be yotzei the mitzvah say. Let's say the first night of sukkahs, you won't be yotzei the mitzvah say daraisa of yeshiva sukkah. And this is the only sukkah you have. So the Pri Megadim is misupik in mutter loy lechatchila lalois, if it would be mutter even lechatchila to go into the sukkah ayin cham. Ubebekura Yaakov masik to aser. The Bekura Yaakov he concludes that it would be aser. Why? The chachamim petruhu ayin cham, because he says that in that case it's very nice that you want to be yotzei the mitzvah, but the chachamim patered you, and we know that the yesh kayach bidei chachamim laakar davar min HaTorah b'sheva al taisa. The chachamim could tell you, sit back and don't do anything. It's true that you're not going to be yotzei the mitzvah, but since you would have to be over an iser, you would have to be over an iser d'Rabbanan in order to go be yotzei the mitzvah, the Chazal say better sit back and don't do anything. You're not being over an iser Torah b'kum va'aseh. You're not actively going ahead and transgressing a daraisa. You're passively you're being mavatal and asay by sitting back b'sheva al taisa. And over there the chachamim ha'emidu devarehem, they established and they gave strength to their gzeirus if you're going to transgress a daraisa b'shev va'al taisa. Now, if you take a look at that Pri Megadim, the Pri Megadim also questions this. We said here in the Mishnah Berurah that b'di'eved, if you did climb up into the tree and sit in the sukkah, the Chavetz Chaim said you're yotzei the mitzvah of yeshiva sukkah. The Pri Megadim actually questions that, and the Pri Megadim questions why isn't there a problem of mitzvah haba ba'avera. Now, those who say that there is no problem of mitzvah haba ba'avera, their rationale is as follows. They say that the problem of mitzvah haba ba'avera is only when the chayfetz of the mitzvah is actually a devar iser. So let's say you have stolen matzah. Stolen matzah, the matzah itself is a stolen item. So if you want to use that matzah to be yotzei mitzvah, that's a mitzvah haba ba'avera. You want to be yotzei a mitzvah with a stolen chayfetz, with a chayfetz shel iser. That's a problem of mitzvah haba ba'avera. That's not the case over here. In the case over here, you made a treehouse sukkah. The sukkah itself is actually a perfectly kosher sukkah. It's a perfectly kosher sukkah with kosher walls, kosher schach, kosher everything. The problem is that you don't have access to it because of an issa d'Rabbanan. There's an issa d'Rabbanan that doesn't let you use the sukkah, because if you use the sukkah, you're using a tree. And there's a takanas chazal against using a tree on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But the chayfet shel mitzvah, the sukkah, is not a chayfet shel iser. It's not an inherently aser sukkah, and therefore, if b'di'eved you do use it, it's not a problem of mitzvah haba ba'avera. Now let's go weiter here in Siv Gimel in the Mechaber, where 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 lines down near the end of the line, right by the ice cut you test for the Mishnah Berurah. So the first case in Siv Gimel was you made a sukkah on top of a balchai, or you made it on top of a tree. Now in the second case, says the Mechaber, miktsasa al ha'ilon umiktsasa b'davar acher. Let's say you built a sukkah, and the sukkah is partially supported by the ground and partially supported by a tree. If the sukkah is constructed in a fashion where if you would go right now and cut down the tree, the sukkah would still stand, and the sukkah would still be a kosher sukkah, then you're allowed to go on to this tree house, this quasi-tree house sukkah on Yom Tov. But if that's not the case, if the case is that if you would remove the tree, the sukkah would collapse, then then you're not allowed to use this sukkah on Yom Tov. Ice cotton yutes, miktsasa ala ilan miktsasa b'davar acher. If the sukkah is partially supported by the tree and it's partially supported by something else, it explains the Chavetz Chaim. Hainu, this case is sha'asa mikta karka is sukkasai or mikta staf noiseha al roisha ilan. Part of the floor of the sukkah is supported by a tree. Part of the walls are supported by a tree. But the rest of it is supported by something else. So let's say, for some reason, you wanted to raise your sukkah above ground level. So you took a couple of 4x4 posts and you sank them into the ground, and you supported one side of your sukkah on 4x4 posts. And on the other side of the sukkah, there was a very conveniently situated tree. So you supported the other side of your sukkah on the tree. So here you have part of the sukkah is perfectly fine. It's supported by 4x4 posts on the ground. What's wrong with that? Nothing wrong with that. The other side of the sukkah is a problem because the other side is supported by the tree. So what's the halacha? Well, let's continue the Mishnah Berurah here. So, Hainu sha'asa mixas karka is sukkasai, or mixas taf deisal roisha ilan, or mixas karka isa, mixas taf deisal davar acher, v'siche chaladafanois. And then you have perfectly good schach up on top of the walls of this sukkah. So, im hiasuya be'inyan she'im yinot elo ilan. Tishair hi omedes ala davar acher v'loi tipal. If the sukkah is built in such a way, let's say you had one side of your sukkah, like I said, is supported by these 4x4 posts. And maybe a second side of the sukkah is also supported by 4x4 posts. Then all the way on the other side of the sukkah is being supported by the tree. But you built the sukkah in such a fashion that if you would cut down the tree and pull the tree away, there's enough support being given by those 4x4 posts that the sukkah would stand. In that case, Ois Kat and Chaf, says the Mechaber, you would be allowed to use this sukkah on Yom Tov. Now, you can't climb the tree to get access to the sukkah on the side where it's supported by the tree, because you're not allowed to climb a tree on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to use a tree on Yom Tov. But if you go up into this sukkah by use of a ladder, you could use the entire sukkah, even the side of the sukkah that's being supported by the tree. You know why? Because we look at this sukkah as not being supported by the tree at all. Since the fact is that if you would cut down the tree and pull the tree away, the sukkah would remain standing. So essentially, this sukkah is not supported by the tree. So when you use the sukkah, you're not using the tree. So therefore, this is a perfectly kosher sukkah, and you could use it on Yom Tov. But on the other hand, if it's built in such a fashion where if you would cut down the tree and you would pull away the tree, the sukkah would collapse, then then you're not allowed to use this sukkah on Yom Tov. Because since it's being supported by the tree, nimtza, it comes out when you go into this sukkah. I don't care where you go into it or how you go into it. Even if you go into the sukkah with a ladder, and even if you go into the sukkah right on the side where it's supported by 4x4 posts. Since the fact is that minus the tree, the sukkah would collapse, that means that this entire sukkah is supported by the tree. And wherever you go in the sukkah, you're being mishtamish be'ilan, you're using a tree. And you're not allowed to be mishtamish be'ilan b'yomtiv. Mishtamish be'ilan, you're using a tree, and you're not allowed to use a tree on yomtiv. Okay, this concluded Siman Taf Reish Chaf Ches. Now let's go to Siman Taf Reish Chaf Tes. Incidentally, we just used over here in this Bechaber, in Siv Gimel, we kept on using the word oilin law. You're allowed to go up to the sukkah. This has nothing to do with the fact that the sukkah is in a tree. That's not why we use the word oilin, to go up into a sukkah. If you look at the Gemara again, those of you who are learning Daf Yomi would see this already. The Gemara always uses the phrase oilin, going up into a sukkah. And I think that's because commonly the sukkahs were built on their rooftops. So the Gemara always refers to going up to the sukkah, to lowering the kalim down out of the sukkah, because the sukkahs were erected on the rooftops. Nothing to do with going up a tree. Okay, we have a few minutes left. Let's start Siman Taf Reish Chaf Tes. Mimat tzarich liyos schach. What does schach have to be made out of in order to be kosher? Uba yud tes seifim, and here we have 19 seifim. Says the Mechaber in Sif Aleph. Davar shemesachichin by whatever you're going to use for the schach on your sukkah, tzarich sheyiyeh tzaimeach min haaretz. It has to be something that grows from the ground. V'talush, and now when you use it, it has to be removed from the ground. Ve'enoi mekabel tuma, and it has to be something that cannot be mekabel tuma. This doesn't mean that it's not tummy now. It means that it cannot be mekabel tuma. It's not roi lekabel tuma. It's not fit to be mekabel tuma. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah's Cotton Aleph. Tzarich sheyiyeh, it has to be something that grows from the ground. How do we know this? It says the Chavetz Chaim Diksiv, because it says in the pasuk, Chag HaSukkos taseh, you should make the Chag of Sukkos ba'aspecha migarnecha umiyikvecha, when you gather from your threshing floor and from your wine press or from your wine vat. V'darshinan, and the Gemara learns out from that pasuk, sheyasa hasukos, that we have to construct the schach of the sukkah mima shema'asef mipesolis garin vayekev, using the psolis, the leftovers of the threshing floor and the wine vat. What does that mean? Dahainu kashin, this means straw. You take your grain, you harvest your grain, you bring it to the threshing floor, and you thresh it. What do you have left? You have straw, you have chaff. That's the garbage that you have left. What do you have when you bring the grapes to the wine vat, to the wine press? You remove the grapes from the clusters, ve'eshkolos reikonin, and you're left over with those woody, empty grape clusters. Hilkach, therefore, based on this drasha, ein mesachichin, we can only use as schach elo b'davar shetzaimeach min haaretz. It has to be something that grows from the ground, like this straw and like these empty grape clusters. V'hu achshav talush, and it has to be something that is already uprooted from the ground. When you bring your grain to the threshing floor, it's no longer b'mechuber; it's already talush. When you bring your grapes to the wine press, it's already talush; it's already been cut down. Ve'ena makabel tuma, and it also has to be something that's not makabel tuma. Dumya de psolis garin v'yekev, just like the leftovers of the threshing floor and the wine press. Sheyesh behem kol hadvarim halalu. They're tzameach min ha'adama. They grow from the ground. They're talush, and they're not makabel tuma. Ice cotton bays ve'ena makabel tuma. Pirish, this means she'ena roy lekabel tuma, that they're not fit to become tummy. They cannot become tummy. Let's go a little bit further. Aval, however, says the Mechaber here in Sif Aleph, davar she'enoi tzaimeach min haaretz, something that does not grow from the ground. Aval pi shegiduloi min haaretz, even if it, so to speak, is nourished from the ground, but it does not grow from the ground. Ve'enoi mekabel tuma, even if it's not mekabel tuma. Kigoyin, for example, oirois shel behema, hides of an animal, shaloi nevdu, that have not been tanned. So these are raw hides of an animal. She'ena makabel tuma. If you just strip the hide off an animal, it's not makabel tuma. It's not a keli yet. It's not a utensil because you didn't do the tanning process on it yet. So it can't be makabel tuma. And this is giduloi min haaretz. An animal does not grow from the ground, right? But it lives on the ground and it eats from the ground. So it's giduloi min haaretz, and it's not makabel tuma. The hide of the animal is not makabel tuma. Or let's say you want to use metal poles. Metal poles are giduloi min haaretz. Where does metal come from? Metal is mined from the ground. And if you just mine a piece of metal from the ground, it's not makabel tuma because it's not a keli, so it's not makabel tuma, and it is giduloi min haaretz. Still, ein mesachichin behem. You cannot use them for schach. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Cotton Gimel, aval pi shegiduloi min haaretz, even though it grows on the ground, keloimar. What the Mechaber wants to say over here is shemizgadel, that it grows and it's nourished al haaretz, on the ground. Or l'shoin min, when the Mechaber uses the word min, which literally means from, lav dafka, he's being imprecise, because an animal is not giduloi min hakarka, it's giduloi, it's mizgadel al haaretz. It lives on the ground, but it's not from the ground. Ice cotton dalid min matches, types of metal. Kigon chatichos matchis, pieces of metal, shaloi nasu mehem shum kelim, that have not been formed into utensils, sha'adayin einu mekabelin tumah, so that they're not yet royal lekabel tumah. Va'afti yesoidom gam kein mina aretz, even though they really come from the ground, metal is mined from the earth. V'hu adin afar mamish, or how about dirt itself? Dirt itself is gidulai mina aretz. It's a piece of aretz. That's what it is, and it's not mekabel tumah. Afilu hachi ein mesachichin bahem. Still in all, you cannot use these items for schach. Because you have to make the schach out of something that grows from the ground, like the psoilis garin v'yakev, v'loi karka mamish. It has to be something that grows from the ground, but not ground itself. Okay, we'll stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schach of limud HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rabban should send Yeshua's for us and Parnassus to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the BS Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.